I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, home to the one and only story cycle system. Do you want people to actually give a crap about you and your purpose-driven company? Then our proven system will help you tell them a better friggin' story. And that's the secret sauce, folks. You gotta have a better, clear story. You can get started right now by downloading your 64-page DIY brand story strategy workbook at businessofstory.com. It's filled with examples, links to tutorial videos, and will help you clarify your story to grow your revenue and amplify your impact. And if you're really proud of how your brand story comes together, let me know. We might put you on our show to share your new narrative with the world. So download your story cycle guide right now as you listen to today's show.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
What's your favorite movie? I'm going to give you a second to think about it. And what I want you to do is think back to all the movies you've seen throughout your entire life and which one pops to mind right now. Well, my all-time favorite movie is Amadeus, about the famous classical composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. I've probably seen that film 10 times. I'm so used to it, in fact, that I watched Milos Forman's director cut that added about 20 minutes to the original movie, and I gotta tell you, it didn't need it. The first film, which in 1984 won 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, is some of the finest storytelling I've ever seen. I particularly like the scene with the evil villain Antonio Salieri, a composer himself who desires to be the greatest of all times. Unbeknownst to Mozart, Salieri actually becomes his nemesis. Well, in this one scene, Mozart's wife, Costanza, brings Salieri some of Mozart's original scores. She's trying to get a commission because they need the money. Well, as he thumbs through a leather folder of Mozart's original compositions, he is blown away by what he finds. And as far as the storytelling goes, what's amazing to me is the movie score, because it captures each piece just as if you were listening to it in Salieri's head as he's seeing them. It's just an amazing piece of work, and every time he turns the page in the folder, it reveals another magnificent score. Now, Salieri is so astonished by the brilliance he recognizes on the ink-scribbled pages that he drops the folder containing these priceless pieces, stepping on them as he leaves the room. Salieri had made up his own pact with God, at least in his own mind, to become the world's finest composer. He just dedicated his life to it. But he was totally upstaged by what he called God's creature, this young Mozart. At the end of the scene, he's shaking his fist towards the heaven, and he says to God, "Because you chose for your instrument a boastful, lustful, smutty, infantile boy, and give me for reward only the ability to recognize the incarnation, because you are unjust, unfair, unkind, I will block you. I swear it." And then the movie takes off from there. It's magnificent. It is a murder mystery wrapped in classical music, inspired by the life and death of Mozart, and it is my favorite. That scene is one of the most powerful moments I've ever experienced in a movie. I found a clip of it for you, by the way, and on YouTube, and I put it in the show notes, so feel free to jump over to businessofstory.com and check it out. Now, to me, the 3 words that best capture this film are creativity, inspiration, and passion. And I think all three of those are reflected in the work I do. And that's what takes us to today's show, because they may not mean much to you right now, but our guest uses this technique of identifying your favorite movie as an insight into your personal life story and what you stand for. For 3 decades, Sheila Carroll has been a professional storyteller, business owner, head of a nonprofit, and creator of a story-based curriculum. She is a self-proclaimed story geek and proud of it. Sheila has a unique approach to guiding entrepreneurs and small business owners to discover and tell their stories. She believes that our finest work is an expression of our story, or at least it should be. On today's show, Sheila will help you find your story and share 5 simple ways to get your stories to stick. She explores the power of mirror neurons in your storytelling and why your earliest memory may be the cornerstone for your most memorable life story. She'll even reveal her favorite movie and why. Now, have you arrived at yours yet? Let me know at the end of the show. Just shoot me a note over at park@businessofstory.com. Would love to hear from you and love to hear what story has really moved you and the 3 words that define it in your life. But first, here's Sheila Carroll. Sheila, welcome to our show today.
Thank you so much, Park. I'm happy to be here.
This will be a fun episode to dive into because so many of our stories, really all of our stories, are shaped around the beliefs and values that we hold dear as people and are expressed through our brands, organizations, companies, and so forth. And the goal, isn't it really to connect our beliefs and values that we share with our audiences, connect them through the stories that we live and tell and invite them into to be a part of our world?
Hey, you're singing my song. That's exactly, we want to build not just trust, but a sense of community, even if it's just one-on-one, a sense of that the person that you're trying to reach out to, your customer or your client, is somebody that can resonate with what matters to you. But if you don't know what matters, if you can't express it, then it's going to come off sounding hollow.
Yeah. So let me ask you, Sheila, you've been doing this a long time. Why doesn't regular advertising and marketing do that? Why can't we just put up our ads and hopefully they're going to share our beliefs and values there?
Well, it used to work back in the 40s, maybe even 30s, I don't know, but 40s and 50s and 60s, that kind of advertising works, then, but it doesn't work now. And it's because we have hundreds of channels, and I don't mean television channels. I mean things coming at us from all different directions. And we've become a bit more jaded and cynical than in earlier days. We're talking about a whole different generation. I grew up in the hippie generation. And
the hippie generation, what, the 60s?
Yeah, 60s and 70s. Yeah, you bet. So this is my 3rd act here as a story coach. I worked as a professional storyteller for almost 20 years, and then I ran a business, story-based.
Wait a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want you to define what a professional storyteller is for me, because I hear that a lot, and I think with our listeners too, it's like, so what? Did Sheila just run around the country telling stories, or what is a professional storyteller?
That's a great question. Well, the short answer is I earned my living telling stories. Now, what that worked out as is I did performances in front of groups. I did story workshops teaching others how to do it. I think those are the 2 main venues that I had. I developed materials, wrote books, and so as time went by, I developed this approach to viewing how I saw story in my life, what it could do for me, and then what I felt it could do for others. And I found it to be transformative. So that's what it means to be a.
How so is it transformative?
Because stories are about change. If a story doesn't have a transition, so a story works because it has 3 things. It captures the attention, it makes you feel something, and it invites change or some action. So the action is a change. So even if you're listening to a folktale, which I love the folk tales. I still tell folk tales to business people. At first, their eyes roll, and then they just start listening, and they're touched as much as anyone. The folk tales are part of our universal culture, if you will, and they're about things that are true. So when you talk about something being transformative, you're speaking of, in the story, there's a transformation. There's always a transformation, or it isn't a story. But the listener has to feel the shift in themselves. And that's where being a good storyteller comes in. You can't just tell a story, you have to tell it well.
Tell us a folk tale, will you? I mean, no one's done that yet on 120 plus shows.
Oh my
here at
gosh,
Business Story.
I would love to.
Give us one of your favorite folk tales that has a business point that you might share in the business world.
Oh, yes. Okay. This one is called The Single Grain of Rice. And it goes like this. Once there was a king, and he had 4 daughters, and he called them to him, and there they stood like stair steps, one shorter than the other. And he said to them, I'm going away to seek the meaning of life, and I'm leaving the kingdom in your hands. And the 4 daughters looked at him and said, Father, we're just children. How can we rule a kingdom? And he laughed, and he said, Peace. I will not leave you without a means. To each of the 4 daughters, he placed in their open palms a single grain of rice. The oldest daughter, the king went away, of course, and the oldest daughter looked at her grain of rice, and she said, I know what I'll do. I'll take good care of this because Father gave it to me. And so she got golden thread and spun it into a long golden chain, and tied that grain of rice to the end of it, and then looped it into a crystal box with a crystal top and set it on a shelf. Every day she would go and look at that grain of rice. Now the second daughter, she was a little more practical. She went and got leather, soft as butter it was. She sewed it into a tiny pouch. And she said, well, if Father gave me this, I'll keep it with me everywhere I go. And so she tied it to her waist with the little grain of rice inside. The third daughter, well, she looked at that grain of rice in the palm of her hand. She screwed up her face and she said, this is only a dumb grain of rice. And she threw it away. The fourth daughter, she thought and she thought and she thought a long time before she finally decided what she would do. Time passed. The king returned, and a great banquet was held celebrating the return of the king. At the end of the banquet, he stood up from behind the great table, his beard now grown longer and with it many white hairs, and in his eyes a new look of wisdom. He called his 4 daughters to him, and there they stood now grown taller. And he said to them, give me back the grain of rice I gave you when I left. The oldest daughter, she ran for her crystal box and took it out with the long golden chain and the grain of rice at the end. She ran to her father and handed it to him. He took it in the palm of his hands. He bowed and he said, thank you. The second daughter, she didn't have to go anywhere. She always kept that little pouch with her. She reached in and she pulled out the grain of rice and she placed it in her father's hands, and he bowed and said, thank you. The third daughter, now you remember her. That's right. So she ran down into the kitchen where they had rice for cooking, and she took out a grain of rice, and she ran back, and she placed it in her father's hands without a word and said, and he took it in his hands and he bowed and he said, thank you. The fourth daughter stood before her father, and she said, Father, I don't have my grain of rice. And the king looked thoughtfully at her and said, why? Well, Father, I thought about that grain of rice. I thought a long time. And I realized that a grain of rice is a seed. You plant seeds. So I dug a hole and I put that grain in and I covered it over. I watered it well. And after a season, a rice plant grew up. And on it were more grains, more seeds. I took those, I planted those, and harvested those and replanted. Father, I've been sowing and harvesting every year since you left. Come and see. And she took her father to the window, and there, as far as the eye could see, was field after field after field of rice. So much rice that the kingdom would never need to worry about food ever again. The king, seeing this, took the golden crown of rule off of his own head, and he placed it on the head of his youngest daughter. She ruled her kingdom from that day forth, and she ruled it wisely and well. And that's the story.
It's a great story. And so when you're telling that in a business scenario, what is the business point or the moral that you're trying to express to your audience?
Well, the first thing I do is have a conversation with them and ask them I ask them to tell me back the story, and they can do it very easily. And this is important when you want your audience to get a point. They have to own it a bit for themselves, not just hear it. And so I say, how many daughters were there? What did the first daughter do? And so I get group participation going. Now, if it's online like this, I can just ask the same questions, but pause and let people think. And then I say, which of the 4 daughters do you most identify with? Now, what's so interesting about this story is that most people do not identify with the 4th daughter. They recognize something in themselves that they're missing. Now, then I point out to them that the 4th daughter was able to look at a grain of rice and see a seed. And that's the transformative part in business, is not just to see the products you have to sell, but the potential behind them. The gift that you're giving to your customers by your wonderful product or service.
And as I tell them often, it's not what you make, but what you make happen. In this case, she made happen these fields and fields of grain, of rice, which then ultimately led her to the ultimate prize, the crown of the kingdom, right?
That's exactly right. And this multiplying effect of being able to see beyond what's right in front of our faces, the physical things that we think, or the practical things, like the second daughter. To see beyond the practical things and see the potential in things is a kind of thinking that will transform a person's life, their business. It's a wonderful way to live, really. What's the potential here? What am I offering that's invisible in my visible product?
Exactly. So that is a great story. I love it. The folklore, you've got it in business. How, though, do you get that into the business realm when you have so many business leaders sitting around going, oh, don't tell me a story. Oh, God, here they go. They're telling me something I'm supposed to get all touchy-feely about. You hear that all the time. And yet, you just underscored that this was a great way, a very humanistic way to share a point. And, oh, by the way, to also share a lot of data that becomes all of a sudden immediately memorable. How many daughters? 4. What did the first daughter do? Use gold thread to help protect it and then place it in a safe place. Data. What did the second daughter do? Well, she put it in a leather pouch and she kept it close by her side and ran around. So, all these are data points that then has a really great business point at the end of it. And, you don't have to sell me because I'm a big believer. I've seen the power of story, but I can tell you, Sheila, and I'm sure you've seen it in your career as a professional storyteller, that you will get a lot of business people totally reluctant to use a story like that in the boardroom.
Absolutely. And so that's not where I start. I don't start with a folk tale,
right?
Unless I'm feeling really brave. But most of the time I don't, because I understand that I'm coming into a way of life, really, a way of thinking in which emotions are not a factor. We're just talking business here. It's business, right? I grew up in a home where my father was a very successful businessman, and he used to talk to me about get your ducks in a row, and just he would talk to me in very short phrases like that had everything to do with let's get it right the first time, do advanced planning. And I can't ever remember him talking to me about how passionate he was about his business.
What line of work was he in?
He was a manufacturer of pickles.
Wait. A manufacturer of pickles? That sounds really cold. So I don't want to eat a manufactured pickle, but I suppose it is, isn't it?
He was in manufacturing. So
okay, all right.
So if I say he was a pickle packer, that doesn't quite express it. But he actually was at one time the president of the National Pickle Packers Association.
Awesome. I mean, you got to have a niche. You got to have a niche.
And his approach to business was always very practical. And yet, if you see, again, this is like the girl in the story. If you look below the surface, if you think about what you're looking at. So here's my father, who looks very practical and not touchy-feely at all. Okay, but I was late one time for, we had a house cleaner and I was supposed to take her somewhere and I was late getting there. And he stopped me and he lectured me. He said, you don't do that to people that you think are, and he used the word little people. That was back in the 60s, right? Okay. I mean, it was okay to use a phrase like that. But what he meant was people who are in professions that are working class. He said, you don't do that. You treat them just like everybody else. I never forgot it. And he would do things like, for example, to have pickles, you have to grow them as cucumbers. And that meant that you had to work with farmers to produce a good crop, and the farmers had to use migrant labor. My father would take me out in the fields with him, and I would see these migrant laborers, just little kids, working away. And they would send their money home to their families in Mexico. But what was happening is there was graft in the post office system. So he went to Washington and he got a bill passed so that wouldn't happen anymore. So this Mr. Practical really, in his actions, was seeing below the surface. He was seeing the humanity in all of us and not creating an artificial structure in his world. Does that make sense?
It totally does. And it's just like the folk tale you just told, seeing beyond the rice grain into the seed. Yes. And what could really be. Now, you work with small businesses all around the world.
I do.
How do you bring story and how do you coach them and get people thinking and realizing that it is within their own true stories well told that they reveal themselves, their characters, and what they truly believe in and value, their own truth that needs to be expressed through their company if they're going to be successful? How do you get to that point?
Well, I'm so glad you're going to give me a chance to answer that, because this has been so exciting for me for the last, several years now, since I moved out of being a full-time business owner of a curriculum company and into doing what I'm doing now as a story coach. And that is that I began to discover something about the memories. Now, I know a lot about story. I can talk a lot about story structure. I can talk about how it works in our lives and why our brains remember stories. But when I began to see and talk to people, for example, I ask my clients when I get started with them, this is the warm up, okay? And then I'll talk about how I get really down into it. But I ask them, what is their favorite all-time over-the-top movie? So your listeners can think about that for a minute. Now, I mean, it's one either that you've watched many times. My husband's is Ice Station Zebra. He's probably watched it 50 times, I guess.
And what's yours?
Around the World in 80 Days.
All right. Okay.
I mean, that is such an old movie. Nobody even knows about it anymore. But that's it. Now, my next question is, I asked them, just as I did with the folktale, I asked them, tell me a little bit about that. What were some of the high points? And so they have to recall the movie a little bit. But what they recall, I mean, it's an hour and a half movie, yet they recall only certain scenes, certain bits of dialogue. Now that's a relevant point, and I'll come back to it later. They can't tell you the whole movie, but they can tell you these really exciting moments or moments that were tragic or whatever it is. Then I say, all right, now I want you to think about this movie that you've just told me about. Use 3 words that describe that movie. And they think about it and they come up with their 3 words. Sometimes it's 4, and that's okay. But 3 somehow is a more dynamic number in doing this exercise.
Yeah, the power of 3. We hear that often. Yep.
The power of 3. So in my case, it's adventure, romance. Now, romance in the sense of the romance of life, all right? We're not just talking about boy girl, but romance. And let's see, I've got to remember my third one. Against all odds. And then I ask the question, I say, how do these 3 qualities show up in your life? And that usually blows their minds because they begin to see the relationship between a movie they love and how it impacted them, a story, and their own life. And so I lead them through this, and so that they can see that stories are patterns for us. Stories are many things, but they're also patterns. We are looking for patterns. And this is the exciting part that I've figured out. And that is that within us, there's already a story telling itself. And when we resonate with a movie or a book or a person, that's because it's that story saying, hey, that's me. I'm here. What's your purpose? That's your meaning. That's what matters to you. And when people begin to understand that, when my clients begin to understand that, it's powerful stuff because they're now hooked into what's absolutely, utterly unique in them. Nobody else has what they have. And when they understand that and then live out of that, see, that's the piece that's important, is you can know your story, but you have to live your story. So if I'm talking to a client who is not living those 3 things, let's talk about how we can find those 3 things in your life and help you use that in your business.
Do they roll their eyes at you sometimes? Are they like, oh, Sheila, come on? Or do they recognize it immediately?
Immediately, they recognize it. So then when we begin in earnest, I ask them 3 different sets of questions. This is over a period of time. One is, what is your earliest memory? And the second is, what are the defining moments in your life? The moments that you can look to in which something happened that there was a before and after. And it can be a happy or a sad thing. The tragedies of our lives are often where our deepest life lessons come from, and the way that we can connect most deeply with our clients and customers. So people will sometimes say to me, oh, I had such an awful childhood. I don't want to talk about it. And I'm very gentle and very careful with all of that because we're talking about a trust relationship here. And but I gradually lead them back into some of those experiences and ask them to tell me the story and then what was the life lesson. And when they can tell me what the life lesson was, there's healing that happens. And it's like energy that gets released into their life, their relationships, their business that was just all bottled up there. And so that's an exciting part. I try and show business people that you don't have to be all business. Having a heart-centered, that's kind of a cliche now, but speaking from an authentic self.
Yeah. And it's sad that you characterize it as a cliche, being heart-centered, because I mean, I guess we have gotten so callow.
Yes.
Is that
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
right word I'm looking
I think
for?
so.
That it's like, it's okay to be heart-centered. It's okay to have a purpose-driven organization that is much bigger and greater than just making money. And that typically comes out of the beliefs and values that you hold dearly, that you share through your products and
Yes.
services.
It absolutely
You know,
does. And I want to tell you just about a client that I had. Of course, I wouldn't use any names or anything, but this was an interesting situation because people who are in business will appreciate it. It's actually two men. They were a team, and they contacted me because they knew they needed help. They were part of a very large insurance company. I mean, like national, and they were what you call intrapreneurs. They had created this business within the company. Now, their approach, and an insurance company, innovation is not the first word that comes to mind, right? Okay.
correct,
But
right? I'm with
they
you there.
uh, wanted to create a climate in which innovation was possible in order to save lives, to prevent injuries, not only within the corporation, but for the people they serve. Now that is an exciting problem, don't you think?
There's a lot of opportunity in that, you know?
Yeah.
It's not just selling something. It's like we're actually having a human impact here.
Yeah. So the way that I approached this was, first of all, to elicit some stories from them. Tell me about the. Usually, I don't ask earliest memories when I'm in that kind of a setting. So I drove to the company, and we had a boardroom, and so in that setting, I don't really start there. I start with. Kind of explaining how it works, why story is memorable, and that if they can learn to tell what they do in a way that their people can hear, then they'll have the cooperation that they need to move their venture forward. So once I explain all of that, then I say, well, tell me a little bit about yourselves. And so they'll say, well, I did this, I went to college, and I don't say this to them, but I would say this to your listeners: your resume is not your story. I'll say it again. Your resume is not your story. And that is, I think, a mistake that a lot of people make, is that it's I go to about pages all the time because that's one of the things I like to help people with, is their about page. And I find the same thing. It's just a list of accomplishments. And that isn't what your client or your customer wants to know. They want to know, can you help me and do you understand me? So here we have a company where the biggest audience that they need to sell to is the IT guys. Now, I know about IT guys because I work with them a lot on my website and different things that I'm doing. And they think most of the people in the world are a little brain dead. And so they, am I right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay. So because they understand the depths and complexities of internet technology, and can talk about it at an amazing depth. However, uh, they need to know, most of all, you're not going to mess with their systems. So here's how I approached it with these two guys. So I asked them to tell me, who do they admire? And so they each told me a story. The one actually was the boss of the other, but they worked very much in tandem. And this fella said that when he was in the different job, and he was much younger, he worked with a pediatric surgeon. And the pediatrics, now he was still doing much of what he does, which is to troubleshoot and how to improve and get better use of the materials in this particular hospital. But this pediatric surgeon saw something in him, and he asked him on a regular basis to come in to the surgical auditorium and observe him as he's operating on little tiny hearts. So babies, and he's doing heart surgery, for example. That was his specialty. And at the end of the surgery, this man would come out and he'd still be in his scrubs. And he would say to this gentleman, "What did you see? What did you observe?" And he essentially asked this person to narrate back, to tell him back what he saw. Now, the surgeon was looking for any way that he could do something better, but he was also taking this man under his wing and helping him to see below the surface. Once again, the same lesson of the folktale, see below the surface. As a result of this, over a period of a couple of years, he was able to see things other people don't see in that setting, in a setting where there are a lot of people involved, a lot of equipment involved. He could see things others couldn't see, and he could anticipate problems other people couldn't. That's a terrific story. And I coached him on telling that story as a way to introduce what they wanted to do.
And these were the guys at the insurance company.
Correct.
Yeah. And so he was using a very humanistic story, really kind of outside of the insurance world and the medical world, of something he personally experienced that says something about him, what he admires and what his passions are, and what he uniquely brings in his character to the particular business situation.
Exactly. Now, when he actually did the presentation, he, of course, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, and we're here to talk about," and by the way, this project was called an innovation pipeline. So it was a way for everybody in the company to have input into what needs innovating.
Yeah.
And so he would introduce that, and he would then say in one sentence what he felt, the gift that he brought. He didn't use that word, but what he brought to the table. And right. So then he tells the story to illustrate his point.
Absolutely. And it reveals his beliefs and values and why he's the right person for the gig or whatever his offering is. I do a lot of work with storytelling for leaders, and it's from a group out of Melbourne, Australia called Anecdote. And they've got a wonderful ebook that you can download for free called Character Trumps Credentials.
Yes.
And it is story after story, idea after idea that it plays to what you're talking about right here. Is nobody cares about your credentials, your resume, unless they know that you actually care about them and can help them, which is all about your character. And you're going to find your character revealed through the true life, non-fictional events that you can talk about that reveals that character that the human mind absolutely cannot resist. It just loves that stuff. And yet in business, so often it's like, "Oh, don't give me that soft skill storytelling stuff. Just give me the bottom line," like your old man did, just give me the bottom line. What's it mean to the numbers? You've got also a PDF that people can download, and I think we'll be able to get it in our show notes, right? By going to SheilaCarroll.com/park.
That's right.
Thank you for using my name.
Yeah,
That's
you're
great.
welcome. I've got a special page set up so that they can go and download this. And the PDF is really to introduce this idea of that there are stories, and then there are stories that are made to stick. And what we mean by that, sticky stories, is an expression that sometimes I see around. And I'd like to just take a moment to explain about that, because it's not always understood why stories work. We can talk about stories, but why do they work? One of the current research in brain research is the discovery that there are mirror neurons. So our brains are full of neurons, and every time we do something new, it creates a neural pathway up to our brain, and a neuron is actually burst. I watched a TED Talk in which they showed a neuron being burst. It was powerful. And the point here, though, is that there are a separate set of neurons called mirror neurons. Is this something you've talked to your people about before?
Not a lot. We've covered it a little bit, so keep going. This is fascinating.
Okay. So what they discovered by mistake, actually, and now they're actually going back in and learning more about it, is that if you wire a person's brain who's telling a story, and you wire the brain of the people that are listening so that you can measure activity, the person telling the story, there's a certain part of their brain that lights up, and you can see it on a screen. The part that really surprised them was that the people listening, their brain lit up in the same place. Now, let me unpack that a little bit. We typically think as we're listening that we're analyzing, but actually what's happening is we are not analyzing, we are re-imaging. We are seeing again the images that are being conveyed to us in a story. You can't do that with a fact. You can sit there and read statistics all day long, and the listener will not fire, not in that way, in the same part of the brain. It's only with story. That's significant because if you want to reach your customers, if you want to show them that you care, you have to give them pictures for their mind that they understand, so that their mirror-neurons can fire in the same way. So if you understand this simple, well, it's not so simple, I guess, but this basic principle, then you find that you reach out to your people, even if you're writing an email, you reach out to them in a very different way. If you know that they're seeing it the same way you're seeing it, the better the story, the better the response, the better the mirror neurons are firing.
You know, Sheila, I don't know if you've ever heard of Jonathan Gottschall. He wrote The Storytelling Animal, Why Stories Make Us Human.
Yes.
And he was on my show here, one of the very, very first guests. So he was a business of story pioneer. Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. But he talks about the bewitchery of story, or one of my favorite lines of his is the human mind yields helplessly to the suction of story. And it is for the very reason you say, because our mirror neurons light up, and stories are always about the visual that you create in people's minds so that they can picture what's going on, because we're helpless to it. We are going to picture that no matter what. And if you're telling a rotten story, if you've got a PowerPoint full of stats, facts, and data, people, believe me, have heard me rant on this over and over and over again. If you are not sharing stories, your audience is going to make up their own story. They can't help themselves. It's how we are hardwired by the universe, by the gods, to make sense out of it. So if you're not telling them a story, they're going to make up a story, and probably 90% of the time, it's not the story you were trying to convey.
Oh, yeah. True story, Park.
Yeah. Well, let's get into this. Oh, and by the way, before we go into your PDF real quick, you've got 5 stories in here that we need to know. And maybe I missed it as I was sitting here being your student today, but you said there are 3 stories, there are 3 questions that you ask your clients when you're talking about story. You said, what is your earliest memories? They tell what that is. What are the defining moments in your life, good or bad? And was there a 3rd question in there that I missed?
Yes. People you admire.
Oh, okay. That's where that came in. Who are the people you admire and why?
And they can be living or dead, authors that you've never met.
Mm-hmm.
And each one of those 3 areas, the most powerful, believe it or not, is earliest memory.
Mm-hmm.
May I just pause? I know we want to get back to the stories that stick, but this is all relevant to that. I was working with a CEO, a woman who was just, very good at what she did. She kept going up the ladder, and yet one more bigger company and bigger benefits package, but she knew she needed help with her story, and so I was working with her. It was an interesting process because she saw herself a woman often will see herself as very caring and nurturing, right? Even if you're in business. You can be hard-boiled, but you can also be a woman and caring and nurturing. And indeed she was, no question about it. But when I asked her what her favorite movie was, it was Dirty Dozen. Now, for your listeners who don't know what that movie is actually worth going and watching on Netflix or wherever you get your movies, because this is 12 men who are on death's row in prison during World War II, and they are given the option of they can go ahead and be killed in death row, or they can sign on to this mission, and which very likely will not succeed. And if it does, you get your freedom. The mission was to take a fortress, a citadel in Greece, actually, I think it was, or it might have, oh no, it was in Germany. Okay. And these guys were a piece of work. They were all pretty gritty and hard to deal with, and everybody had their own part to play. And she said she watched that probably 100 times.
100 times. And why?
She would sit there with her father, who loved it, and her brother. So when they were younger, they would do that. When she would come home to visit family, they would say, let's watch Dirty Dozen together. They knew all the dialogue. They knew all the scenes. And I was blown away by the fact that she watched it that many times. And I asked her the questions, right? What 3 qualities? And I'm trying to remember what her 3 qualities were, but they were essentially, getting the job done, pushing through the fear, and I forget what the third one was. But this very aggressive picture of taking the fortress. Well, I pointed it out to her. I said, how do these qualities exhibit in your life? The gasp at the other end of the line was so wonderful, because she saw in herself. She saw a part of herself that she hadn't seen before. Now, she had a new job. She had to win there. She had to show she could do the job. Well, saying, I really care about you and isn't going to do it. Getting in touch with, I can take this fortress. We can do it together. We just need to work as a team. That's much more powerful. So essentially, I helped her see that. And that's
so what you do, in your first round of working with your customers, is you peel back the proverbial onion to get at the heart of who they are and what they stand for, their beliefs and values. Right. And then one of the hardest things that I found too is like, okay, Park, I don't have any good stories to tell, or I'm not sure what story to use. And that's what your PDF is about. Yeah. So let's jump into that. Okay. Let's jump into these 5 stories that people can have in their back pocket.
All right. So we have really been talking, core story is the first one. And core story means what we have been talking about all along. Your deepest held values are in your core story. So when you are able to articulate what those values are, and when I say articulate, to say, I really like adventure, isn't articulating a value. Telling a story of how I went on a pilgrimage, what happened when I went to India and got stuck in a village where, and didn't know what to do. Those are adventure stories. Those are examples of the value. But you're not done yet until you point out the lesson learned. And so it's those 3 components that are important in your core story. So the core story, no question, is a bigger work and isn't something you can do just, in a weekend. But you can begin by using the simple things that I've talked about. So, for example, people you admire. What are the 3 qualities you most admire in that person? You list those. Then you ask yourself, how do those exhibit themselves in my life? Or how can I bring them more into my life? And that process brings you right dead center into your core story. And the funny thing, funny, not haha, but the delightful thing is that once you start doing that, you almost can't stop doing it. It's like a window in your soul has been opened that you've been waiting for. And you now can talk about the things that matter without worry of being thought silly.
Yeah, and to your point, you tell a story to illustrate or show or connect with those mirror neurons that you talked about earlier in your audience's head so that they can see and live vicariously through you and their adventure, whether they've done it or not, but they get to do it from the safety of their own seat. And they go, oh, well, Sheila's really into this, or she's very determined because she got through that. And I want that determined nature or character on my team. And again, it is now having your character trump your credentials. It doesn't matter how many degrees you have. And if you're Six Sigma black belt 9 times over, that's all well and good. That helped got you through it. It's when you find your darkest hours and how did someone react in that area? Like in every single movie, it's the darkest hour where people find themselves and truly reveals their character. And that's what you're trying to do. People want to do business with people that they trust, understand, and have empathy for. And there is no deck, no slide deck full of status, facts, and data that is going to do that for you. It is your story. So you've got the core story to get there. Then you've got number 2, the vision story. What's that about?
That's right. Well, now this is helping your customers see what's possible. And this is in which you want them, you have a product to sell, and you want them to be able to imagine themselves enjoying this product. Now, the vision story can be as simple as that, on that very basic level. Mr. Clean will clean your whole house and everything that's in it. All right. So that's a vision story in a nutshell, if you remember that old commercial. Mm-hmm. So the bald-headed guy with the earring.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay. So,
I'm a product of the 60s and 70s.
Okay. So, yeah. All right. Yep. So I'm trying to think of one that might be more current that some of your listeners might know. But I think the point here is simply that the problem is your house is dirty and you need to fix it. And this is the guy that can do it. And the idea that you have this big, powerful, genie-like magical being come into your house and just whisk through it and make it all happen is it's a vision story. Now, but it's a very basic one. It's one that communicates what the product does, for the customer. But what if you have a team of people that you work with, and you want them to capture the vision for this business that you have, for this venture that you want going forward? How are you going to do it? The story usually begins with the words, imagine a time. Now, somebody that did this famously is Martin Luther King. He didn't say imagine, but he said, I have a dream. And he goes on. I mean, his I have a dream speech is epic.
It is epic. And it also, when you were talking about the vision dream, I was thinking of JFK. We are going to put a man on the moon and replace him, return him safely to Earth within this decade. And we're going to do it not because of it's hard, but not because it's easy, because it is difficult. So talking about a vision story, and that vivid imagery, and talking about that 30-story rocket that we have not yet invented with metal alloys that do not exist, and propellants that we don't even know where we're going to find them, but talking about a terrific vision.
Isn't that exciting? Just even to hear you talk about it, it's bringing science together with courage and the American dream. I mean,
yeah, well, it's science fiction. It's science fiction informing science, because everything he talked about in that vision story, most of it didn't exist. They didn't have the propellants, the metals, the alloys. They didn't even have the navigation system. So total Buck Rogers here informing how NASA was going to come together and make that happen. And it did happen. So let's move into chapter 3 or story number 3, the Who Am I story. What's that about?
Well, you might think that how is that different from a core story? The difference here is the core story is your backstory that you work from.
Like an origin story. Some people will call that too.
Yep. And so the Who Am I story is how are you going to communicate that to the people it matters most to? And in that Who Am I story, you want to make it very brief. They don't want to hear your credentials, as we were talking about before. But actually, one of the great ones I heard was a very humorous story about a guy who showed up at he was now head of a company, a manufacturing company, and he called it, what did he call it? His $10,000 mistake. And he wasn't, the short version of this is he didn't listen to the guy on the line. He listened to the guy that was further up, who said, this is too expensive. We got to cut corners here. And he listened to that one, and he didn't listen to the guy on the line who was saying, no, I've been here 40 years. This is what we need to do to get this result. And so he tells this story as his entree into eliciting the approval and welcome of this company he's now going to run. So I just, if you can find a story where you're screwed up, that's even better. But the point here is, you've got to be self-deprecating. In other words, showing that you're human.
Isn't that the universal, the most potent story structure? Man gets himself in a hole, man gets himself out. And that's what you're talking about. And I think, too, with this Who Am I story, what it does is it reveals your agenda. Because how many times do you go into a sales meeting or you are going to try to push a new initiative and they're looking at you like, oh, what's Park's agenda? There's got to be a hidden agenda. This has got to be really good for him and only okay for us. What is this all about? And the Who Am I types of stories where let me show you where I screwed up royally and how I got out of it and how that impacts what we're trying to do here. It reveals in a very human way your vulnerabilities, that you're for real, that you actually are in this. It's not a zero-sum game. We're all in this thing together. And I think that's where the Who Am I stories are so great. Now you've got the springboard story, which I love that name, the springboard story. So I can only imagine this is about change. How do you communicate change?
And I actually learned this concept. I have to find the book on my shelf here to remember the man's name so I can credit it, but maybe we can put it in the notes, in which he wrote a book called The Springboard Story. This is a man who's been a business story coach for 20 plus years, and he was part of the World Bank. And his job was this was a time when internet wasn't around, and he was asked to find a way to manage all of the information in all of the hundreds or even thousands of places around the world that the World Bank has partners who this combination of it has to work financially, but it also has to be good for the country that it's in. And he tried to sell this idea of a database. I mean, today we wouldn't even think about such things. But then in the World Bank, which was very kind of staid, he couldn't sell it. And then one day he went into a meeting. He was going to try one more time. And he mentioned an email that he'd received from a young worker in Gambia who had gone to the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta on the internet. By then there was internet, and was able to get information about malaria that she could now use in the village she was serving to save people from malaria. And he simply just mentioned this offhand, and the whole room went quiet. My husband calls it the deer in the headlight look.
The deer in the headlight story. Yeah. I love it. Okay.
And you know what I'm talking about. There's a shift.
Mm-hmm. You're godsmacked. You're hit. You're just like, whoa. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So he didn't understand what happened. So he then spent the next several years learning about what are the basics. And one of the things he discovered was that a springboard story may not even be a story at all. And he experimented with this young girl in Gambia. He tried it many different ways. He tried making it a full-blown story with dialogue and lots of imagery. But he found that the only time it worked effectively was this very bare bones description of an event and an outcome. So that's a springboard story. You have to find the bare bones.
Well, and I like that too, because so often when I am out coaching and teaching business storytelling, people will think that they have to come up with some big sprawling epic journey story that they're going to reveal. They've got to be Spielberg or Shakespeare up there doing this stuff. And it's not. It's about the little moments. It's about the little, as you say, the bare bone moments that made a major difference and affected a shift or a pivot in one's thinking or behavior or whatever. And those are the aha moments when you share them very well in a business setting that you can really get people's attention.
Yeah, I think if it's all right with you, I'll include a couple of books that I would recommend.
Absolutely. And finally, your final story in your PDF is the product story. Now, that sounds pretty straightforward. How do you make a product story special?
I think the best way to make that clear is to tell a story about a client that I had. She lived over in Europe. She was a handbag designer, not a purse designer. We don't. When you're up in the upper price tags,
right,
it's a handbag. And she was having trouble selling her really gorgeous, personally designed handbags. Now, I don't hardly even carry a purse unless I absolutely have to put my water bottle in it and my notebook. But I understand the concept as a woman, and I know good work when I see it. And these bags were beautiful. So she thinks in her mind, it's self-evident. All you have to do is look at these bags, and they should sell themselves. And they weren't. And I bet you there's a bunch of people listening who have had that experience with their product or service, that it seems self-evident. So one of the things that I started talking to her about was, tell me the story of how you got started designing handbags. And then the next session was more about, tell me how the bags are made. And it's just asking for stories from people. So for your people that are listening, get a story buddy and say, look, would you just listen to this? I want to tell the story of how I made my product. And just start. Don't imagine that you have to make it polished or anything. Just start. And you will be amazed that the story will take on a life of its own. So this young woman was working for some very big names in the handbag industry and designing for them, but they didn't appreciate. They used her work, they sold her work, but they didn't appreciate her. They never advanced her. They never showcased her, which really they should have done if they were doing their job. So finally, out of frustration, she decided, I'm going to go it on my own. So she started her own company and then began designing the bags. Now that's you had a name for that park earlier, dark moments. All right, yeah.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
mm-hmm.
Yeah. That was a dark moment for her. Like, what am I going to do? I know that what I have is beautiful and needed, and yet I can't seem to communicate it and have people appreciate me. That's a pretty dark moment if you're a very creative artistic type, to not have your work understood and appreciated. So she ended up having a similar problem as she was selling her handbags. So when I asked her, tell me about how the handbags are made, she described at first selecting the color and the leather and some very just basic, how you put things together, the nuts and bolts.
Mm-hmm.
And offhandedly, and see, it's always these offhanded questions. I offhandedly say, well, who puts them all together? Who assembles these? Oh, that's my factory in India. Halt, hold on. You're what? And she described that she has a factory in India in a small village in which the women are all the workers working, and there's a gentleman that oversees it. These women are bringing much needed income into their families, as in most cases their husbands are farmers. And farming in India is very difficult right now. So here are these women able to work with dignity in excellent situations, and the product is something that they can be proud of. I said, do you have any pictures of this? Oh, yeah. So she sends me these pictures of these beautiful women in saris holding the bags.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a story in itself. And
well, now you got humanity attached to it.
Exactly.
You know? Mm-hmm.
You make people feel something. That's the second part. Capture their attention and then make them feel something, and then invite a change. So, yeah.
And typically, if you're going to get them to feel something, you've got to get it to pop in their minds, to illustrate, to show them what you're talking about, whether it's a visual you are literally showing them or a description that allows them to knit together, pardon the pun in this case, those handbags, those ladies doing that in India, so that you can see the event and the human interaction that's happening. And I guess that's what it really ultimately all comes down to is, and I think one of the biggest misnomers out there is that we think, especially in the business to business world, that we have businesses selling to businesses, and we don't. We have people selling to people, humans selling to human. Brian Kramer, a gentleman who was on my show a few years ago, a year and a half ago, I guess, has made a great consulting practice called H2H. I mean, working with people, of showing them how to use stories to connect with people on a person-to-person basis, especially in the B2B world, because it's not about businesses selling to businesses. It's about people helping people.
It is. And if we could keep pulling ourselves back to that, and one of the things I now ask myself every day, how can I live my story more fully today?
Yeah, exactly right. Well, Sheila, how can people find out more about the wonderful work that you do?
Well, thank you. I have a website, SheilaCarroll.com. And by the way, Carroll is 2 R's and 2 L's. It's a good old Scottish name.
Great. And we'll have it in our show notes, certainly.
All right. And of course, you can pick up that PDF on Stories That Stick. And that would be at SheilaCarroll.com/park.
I really appreciate that. And folks, I'm looking at it. I've been scrolling through it as Sheila and I have been talking. It's really easy. It's beautiful. It's going to give you very powerful stories that you can immediately put into your repertoire and actually go right through her process as she described today. You know, what is your movie? And what are the 3 aspects of the movie, the values in that you really admire, and how do they express themselves in your life? And then start thinking about the moments, the real early moments, the pivotal moments in your life that you can sew a story together around and really be able to connect with your audiences. It is so unbelievably powerful. As Jonathan Gottschall says, you will now become like this witch doctor, having literally a story to connect like you never have before. And Sheila, I want to thank you so much for being here on Business of Story. Very, very helpful. I'm glad you reached out. I'm glad we got a chance to get connected.
Park, you've been terrific to be with, and you just could catch everything and bounce it back. It was wonderful. It was a really good experience. So
awesome. Well, I appreciate that. And I want to thank all of you for being here on another edition of Business of Story. Listen, if you like what you're hearing and you want to do me a favor, and even more importantly, you want to do someone in your life a favor, share the show with them, share this episode, let them know about Business of Story so that we can continue to grow and connect with people around the world. Because I really believe it for you, and Sheila, this is, I have a big belief that the most potent story you are going to tell is the story you tell yourself. So the storytelling all starts internally. And then when you can express it to the world, you can be a leader that people look up to, and you can really change the course of events in your life. If you don't like what's happening in your life, change your story. Start living into your true, authentic, nonfiction story, and it is amazing how powerful you can be. And that's the whole mission and goal of the Business of Story podcast, is to connect you with brilliant story artists like Sheila from around the world so that you can continue to craft and tell compelling stories that sell. So please share the show. And if I can help you, be of assistance, you know where to find me, businessofstory.com. I've got a ton of tools there, lots of other show episodes, articles on storytelling. I mean, this is what I do now, and I absolutely love it. So thank you for listening, and join me again next week, next Sunday, when we'll have another story artist here for you. And until then, have a wonderful life.